Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to the Red Pony podcast. Today we are asking the question, what IP do you see as one that really captures real player influence? A game whereby it asks you to make a choice, and the story, the narrative, the world, and its characters around you fit and alter to that choice. It's a concept that many developers have reckoned with. It's a concept that has been repeatedly thrown at us, perhaps even lied behind a commercial sand-dial hourglass until we realize that, in fact, this game doesn't have any real choice. That being said, we're here today to really take a deep look at some of the most proclaimed choice-based real-time player influencing decision games. As addressed in our title, we are going to take a look at what models are exhibited in providing real player choice in these games. And of course, we're going to look at the reality of player choice and what titles are most successful. We're also going to resonate another question that hopefully the community can wrestle with. What's the future of choice-based narratives and choice-based models? We, of course, have a number of titles we're going to address in turn. I think we're addressing the Telltale Life is Strange type first, if that's cool with you. Fantastic. So I'll happily provide an introduction to this and we'll crack on.
Yeah.
Sound good?
Sure.
All right then. Okay, so in terms of the Telltale IPs, we are referring, of course, to the renowned famed Walking Dead multi-series, which debuted in 2012, and the subsequent sequels, releasing in season 2 in 2013, New Frontier in 2016, and the final season in 2018. They also had an ancillary title called 400 Days, which debuted in 2013. There are many other titles alongside this, which there's many to name, but just by way of brevity, we're talking about The Wolf Among Us, came out in 2013, the Batman Telltale series in 2016, the sequel of that, as well as the Tales from the Borderlands, the Batman title. There are many as well, also probably that we have not named, but they're the ones we will focus on. In addition to the Telltale, we're going to be putting together with this Life is Strange, and it's 3 seasons that have now come throughout. We'll also probably include in that category Before the Storm, and I suppose we should start really by trying to define what player choice is and why we've grouped these games together, because there's a hell of a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
How should we begin this?
Right. So, this video is very expansive. Perhaps a little bit too much for one video, but it's what we're doing, so it's fine.
Yes.
But we are talking about choice in general, in whichever rendition or permutation it may manifest itself within gaming. So we're starting with the one which we have most to criticize about and most to talk about, which is I call it choose your own adventure, but Josh calls it interact with your own adventure because it's perhaps a little bit more accurate. And he just mentioned the types of games that would fit it. But after this, we're going to go a little bit outwards from this. We're going to talk about the better version of these types of games, which include games like Until Dawn and Detroit. Then we're going to talk about stuff like the Nemesis System, which appeared in the Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War games. We're going to talk about immersive sims and the type of choice that manifests in those. We're going to talk about CRPGs. So we're going to talk about whatever, as I said, whatever permutation choice can manifest itself in games. We're going to talk about it, and we're going to talk about what's best about it, what can be taken away from it, and to evolve it in the future. And then we're going to be combining all of these together to come up with a conclusion about what the direction of choice is within gaming, as Josh has said.
And hopefully we can do all these things, because it's a hell of a lot to ask.
Yeah.
But in the interest of truth, what I want to focus on is all of these devs, they throw and publishers, they throw around the term player choice as if it's one unanimous term that means exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But in reality, there are multiple games that choose differently what this term means. And I think it's important, just in the pursuit of truth, to say, like, are these guys actually being truthful with the term choice? Mm-hmm. And perhaps we can work out to what extent these are actually using choice, real choice.
So we're beginning with the Telltale-esque games, which we call inconsequential choose-your-own-adventure stories. Because, as we'll come to see, there actually rarely is much choice in these games, and it's not particularly far-reaching, and what these games do better than anything, actually, is create the illusion of choice. And there's a few reasons for this. Some could say that it's merely just them using a marketing tactic, throwing around the term player choice in there to get people to buy the game, when in fact it's perhaps a little bit disingenuous. I don't actually think that's necessarily the intention, personally, all the time. I think especially towards the beginning, Telltale did try to actually make choice-based games, but they ran into a few roadblocks that were caused by poor planning. So I think what initially caused this is the fact that they got a lot of talented writers in a room, and these talented writers, instead of understanding the point of what they're working on, which is to create a game in which there's a lot of player choice, they instead decided to make one cohesive story that goes through different character arcs, and they wanted to hit those moments that they imagine in their head necessarily because they wanted to tell a compelling story. And I think that happens very often, and that's one of the things which leads to the fact that it doesn't end up being much choice, because ultimately these writers want their ideas and these moments to be conveyed. They don't want you to miss out on moments that they've crafted for you. And I've always found that a bit funny, because it kind of defeats the point of making a choice-based game, you know? Like, you could have just made a movie or a walking simulator, and I think that's one of the biggest problems, is that these games do not actually focus on delivering their USP, which is choice. They focus on making cool stories with good characters, and so it ultimately ends up feeling more, as I think you're going to go to explain, and interact with your own story. It kind of feels like a movie where you can kind of pause sometimes and learn some little lore about the characters, maybe in a little bit more depth, and alter a few interactions, but never a story. So that's what I would say.
I just have to bring up your point, and I want to discuss that a bit further quickly. It's just the idea that perhaps it's a limitation of the writing staff, budgeting or something. There's a lot of theories you could throw around in that domain. From a cynical perspective, one might ask the question whether they commercially kind of coined the term early, being kind of a leader in the market, and then they just refused to innovate. And I find that somewhat plausible, even though this may be a controversial point. I just think that it's complicated, really, to say that. I mean, I've adopted the term ancillary choice. It's kind of like cosmetic in the form of the choices. It is peripheral. It doesn't. It's always about the moment to moment, simple character changes. Really, it's about interaction. It's about like, okay, perhaps I'd like Lee in this circumstance to respond in a different light to this way. Or one great example I always have is the example comes back to The Walking Dead season 1, when you first arrive at Clementine's house. You have an option to leave before dark or at dark. It provides zero difference to what happens in the next scene or throughout the entire game. It seems like a big choice, but it genuinely means nothing. So really, I feel like it is more so just cosmetic. It's more about simple interaction. And from a cynical perspective, to me, it seems almost like lying. But I don't want to badger the term to say it is. It's just, it seems like it could be.
Yeah.
So like I said, I've kind of adopted this view of that. It's more so about, at the last minute in the game, there'll be an actual choice. And this takes me back to Life is Strange season 1, where you have the option to save Chloe or Arcadia Bay gets destroyed. It's kind of like right at the end, the choice comes in. Or instead, it's mostly about the moment to moment characterization, short-lived moments of choice. It's not layered, and there are no set pieces of spiraling depth that are promulgated throughout the story. It's just instead short-lived moments of, okay, I'd like, and I love The Wolf Among Us with all my heart, by the way, but it's like, I want Bigby in this interaction to be angrier. You know, it's kind of like that. So, and I've got more examples. For example, in Life is Strange, you have the option to save Kate. It does not affect the reality of the storyline in whether she dies or not, because in reality, she doesn't die. So you can just simply rewind time and change your choice or make your choice. It does not matter. The choice still doesn't change the outcome of the plot.
I just want to clarify something. In Kate's choice, if I remember correctly, you could not rewind time. They made some kind of story explanation to why you can no longer rewind time in that moment. So it kind of felt like your choices mattered, because they did. The way you tackled the conversation was final.
Right.
So you either saved her or didn't.
That's a fair point then.
So I actually think that's one of the better parts of Life is Strange. I just wanted to give credit where it's due. So yeah. Yeah,
no, fair enough then. I must have got that moment wrong. But nevertheless, the choice still doesn't really promulgate throughout the story and change much. That's what I'm trying to just stick to. It's just, and that's not to say in any way, shape, or form, because it does at this point sound like a diss track where we're just essentially saying these games just do not stand up to what they're claiming to be. But it's just, I found a very comprehensive argument online by one guy who's saying, look, even though these games don't actually have real choice, they still create the same, if not even in a way, a better experience on the individual. They provide still the emotional depth. They still have it. Like it's almost an objective question doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if
I need to jump in here because I think this debate / conversation has been one of the most destructive elements in the industry when it comes to these types of games. Because yes, like I said, some very talented writers got in a room and they wrote a movie, a really good movie or a TV show with good characters. Okay. And that's why the reason it feels good or it feels impactful on the characters, because it's a cohesive, linear story, okay? But that's beside the point, because the way these companies are selling these games is that it's about player choice, right? And I think that the argument that this illusion of choice feels still pretty impactful to the player is bullshit. About how it changes, people love to say that the choices that Lee makes, whilst they don't impact the story, they do impact the other character's opinion of him and the player's opinion of him somehow, and I think that's just pseudo-intellectual garbage. The point is that these games do not deliver on what they promise, fundamentally. And look, I love Wolf Among Us and Tales from the Borderlands, but the reason I love them is because they're just good TV shows to me that are mildly interactable. That's what they are, and that's not what they promise with this game, and I think it's actively damaging that we have accepted that choice-based games, are fine like that. It kind of impacts the other character's opinion of the protagonist, and it makes the character feel more like the way the player would want it. That doesn't mean that's a buzzword. That's nothing. And I think it's just this whole conversation where critics kind of, and not only critics but fans, protect the games because they love the characters. It's just damaging. Sometimes you have to accept that something you love also has some pretty big flaws. Like I love Assassin's Creed Origins, for example, but it has some massive flaws in terms of open world design. And you need to, if you want games to get better, you need to actually make constructive criticism, and that's my point. So yeah.
Right, and I'm actually in agreement with you.
Yeah.
So I take the view that what we should do instead, hopefully throughout the future of this genre, this subgenre, is create truly accurate genre names for choice. I feel like we need a distinction somewhere along the lines of interaction but it's of course it's damaging to your commercial enterprise, damaging to your I do sympathize with someone who may say and sit and listen to this podcast, and they may just say, well, look, even though there is some truth in what you're saying, there still is some element of choice. And even though maybe one can make the argument that there are some ending choices that are triggered based on your choices you have. All I'm trying to suggest is that this is not the truth. It's not a truthful choice-based game. You use the term illusory. I think that prescribes some malice behind it, fair to say, but it's whether it's intentional or not is irrelevant. I just say that it's definitely not up to the par of other games that are in our list of choice-based narratives we'll discuss.
Yeah.
So that's my take, basically. It's an inconsequential model. Even though it does use choice, it's not to the extent to say, look, the whole story will change. But even if that's not their ambition, which is absolutely fine, it's just to say you can't use the exact same term and expect people to say it's the same as games like Detroit Become Human, for example.
You can't mislead people, because that's how they market the games, as being, they market the unique selling point as being the ability to completely change the story with your actions. And that's a lie. Yeah. And that's just how it is. And you need to call it how it is sometimes, even though I love Wolf Among Us and Tales from the Borderlands, as I said. But just so it doesn't seem like we're hating on the genre or hating without giving any solutions or anything, I want to say that there are games which do this, which are choose your own adventure, which are consequential and do deliver on this promise. My hot take, actually, is that the only game which does that is Detroit Become Human. The only game I've ever played where player choice actually does matter, it has proper branching paths, etc.
Well, how about we move on to Detroit now?
Yeah.
Because we kind of really explained what we see as this subgenre of inconsequential choice. So, if I may give an introduction to Detroit, okay. It was released in 2018, developed by the reputable studio Quantic Dream. They brought us games such as Heavy Rain. Detroit Become Human was critically really well received for its setting, visuals, and choice-based narrative. It went on to sell in excess of 7 million copies. It's been described as a cinematic adventure game depicting the lives of three androids in a postmodern future where humanity is flourished by the use, ownership, and exploitation of androids, which provide humans with various forms of practical assistance. We are indeed following through the footsteps of three characters, one being Kara, a housekeeper android who starts her story as a caregiver and cleaner for an abusive single father and his daughter. Kara develops consciousness and becomes responsible for the young daughter's well-being. Connor, my personal favorite, is a highly specialized android, tailored to investigate androids that have become deviant. He assists a lieutenant and the police department to investigate and capture such androids. And our third character we see this world through is Marcus. He's in a similar vein to Kara. He cares for an elderly retired artist who has a parallel, quote-unquote, life, who cares for the needs of his owner and human counterpart. Now, with the brevity of the story aside, how do you think choices work in Detroit, as you were trying to say before? Sorry about that.
Yeah. In terms of actual choose-your-own-adventure games, there's cinematic games which are supposed to change according to your choices. I think Detroit is the only one that actually delivers on the promise. It's the only one that even attempts to deliver on the promise, because it actually has mechanics and visual cues in game which let you know what impact your choices made. It has, at the end of each section in the game, it has a huge branching patch,
right?
And you can see where you are on that path and what choice you made that led you there, and you can even see potential other choices that you could have made.
Yes.
And this is intrinsic to the game. And of course, it still is a game that ultimately has a destination that you have to get to. I do feel like this game does actually change quite radically based on the choices you make. And it does it even in pretty creative ways where sometimes it's not about changing the story, but it is about changing the feeling of a moment. Like there's the protest in
Yes.
Protest in the game with Marcus, and you get to choose everything about how that protest unfolds, which kind of gives the group a different sort of slant in terms of your opinion on them, and also some other events later on.
It's actually very important because it shows how humanity responds to it as well, whether they start to despise androids or like androids. So as a narrative point to it as well.
And
right?
There's different endings for each character, and not only different endings, but different permutations of the endings based on their personality, how you chose to play them.
Right.
Connor, for example, you can play him never once deviating from his routines, you know?
Right.
And there's the deviant ending, so yeah.
I just wanted to jump in and say that there are over 100 endings in this game. Just wanted to point that out. Each of the three characters can actually die. If Connor dies, however, he comes back. And that affects the relationships he has with like his tech person who works with the androids and tries to get him to do his job. But nevertheless, Kara can die within pretty early into the game where you get hit by a car and she's done. You never play as her again. The same can happen with Marcus. It has such a diverse sense of ranging choices, and as you mentioned correctly, there is like a flowchart map that appears at the end of every like set piece. That's how they break it down into set pieces. And what I find absolutely riveting is that you can actually see which choices are major. So you'll have often three that are in a line, and then you have ancillary choices, which I kind of marked as being the Life is Strange Telltale formula, where there's little choices which don't really matter so much, but then you've got them alongside the major choices. So you can see this game has broken down its choices. So you can see ones that truly will have an impact, and then ones that simply just say, look, okay, if you want to have gray hair on Kara instead of blonde, there is a scene, for example, where you can have that choice. But it's the idea that, okay, this game's gone further to show like choices will actually change the story. That's what it focuses on. And another example you mentioned was about the protest. One of my favorites is how you can choose to have this revolution by Marcus peacefully or by destruction. And it affects the narrative.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Also, I wanted to say that in terms of ancillary choices, I think this game does it better than the other ones too, in that it actually does completely change your outlook of the game based on the choices you make. It does. And I think even the other Telltale games don't quite achieve that, even with their ancillary choices. Like the painting that you have to draw for Marcus at the beginning of the game kind of really changes your opinion of his character. And it can also subconsciously lead to you making choices based on how you perceive his personality at the beginning. And there's loads of things like that. And also, if I remember correctly, there's seemingly minor choices which can lead to major ones later on. So it's always quite surprising. So yeah, in my opinion, Detroit is the only specifically choose your own adventure cinematic game which actually even tries to deliver on its promise. And I don't understand why. However, I mean, you maybe have a better opinion of this game than me, but Until Dawn is another one which you believe also does a pretty good job, right?
Yes, yes. So I've coined the term consequential model to describe at least Until Dawn to a large extent as well, but most definitely Detroit, based on the factors we've alluded to, and the fact that there are 100 different endings that are tailored and promulgated from the start to end. So essentially, they've built this game to have different endings based on choices. I struggle to, when someone would make the comparison to the Walking Dead series, I struggle to understand any comparison from that perspective. I understand there are a couple of endings that you can perhaps change between, but they're not really based on choices you've made before. And especially with Kara towards the end of the game, there's multiple ways you can get yourself in trouble. And whether you're with your companion, I think his name's Luther, or not, you can give in and die. You can, if you don't have identity documents, there's different ways you can die when the guys will capture you. It's just, I find the comparison, that was one of my real point here, it's just I find the comparison almost not even in the interest of truth. It's just not right.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Also a bit insulting to the amount of work they probably put in these games, but yeah.
True, yes. Again, that's not to say that Telltale and Life is Strange games do not have work into them.
Oh, they have a heck of a lot of work, especially in the writing department. But maybe we should make this once again clear in case we are talking.
Maybe just once.
We are talking specifically about the way they execute their choices and the choice-based element of the game. We're specifically talking about whether they deliver on their unique selling points of having the story and the world change based around your actions. That's all we're talking about. Nothing else for now. Because honestly, I love Wolf Among Us and Tale from the Borderlands again. I do not love Detroit. I think it's, like I said, the best choice, the game which does choices the best in this genre. But I think that Detroit has overall some pretty wonky writing. The world doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to me, and the characters sometimes fall a bit flat, in my opinion, with Detroit. So once again,
there are some.
We're talking about one specific aspect. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I also thought it would be fun, even though we've gone past one already. But it would perhaps be interesting to just kind of give a rating out of 10 for how much they stick to the true definition of choice.
That's a good idea.
And I was thinking, from a Telltale perspective and Life is Strange perspective, I'm almost tempted to give it a 4 or 3. But what would you? I
would give Telltale games, pretty much all of them. None of them really deviate. I'd give them a 4, and I'd give Life is Strange a 5. Like I said, specifically the Kate moment, and there's like a couple other moments like that in the game, which I thought.
I'm really glad you brought that up though, because I didn't know. I totally forgot that you could not rewind time. That does sound right. Yeah. Okay. So I think I'm along the same lines. I'd probably give, to be slightly more cynical about it, based on my points that they could be lying as well. I would give them both a 3/4. Mm-hmm. That's what I would probably give. And again, like you said, Detroit, I feel like you have to give it an upper 8, 9. Again, there are some. I would say there are some set pieces where choices really are limited.
Yeah.
For example, when breaking into the recording studio to broadcast, there's only a couple of ways you can go about it. It's like there are that for a few things, and it's like 2 choices, but there nevertheless are 2 narrative-driven choices, which I still think is pretty good overall. So I'd give it like an 8.
I'd give it a 7, 8, something like that. Yeah, I still think it could be better. I just think it's the best one. But yeah, because you mentioned how there's like 100 endings. I'm sure that like probably half of those are just recolors and like something that isn't particularly major. But yeah.
Well, one criticism that I would put forward, like you said, is with Connor, you can have like this whole story where are you deviant or android? Mm-hmm. It's like this whole game. It's fantastic. But with Kara and with Marcus, you don't really have the same. It's almost like you're going to be a deviant regardless, and they don't really play with that so much. It's more so about what their story is already set out for them, but you have to then navigate that, which does have an effect. It is consequential, but still, Connor's one is so much more, I would say, better than the others. But
yeah, for sure.
Okay, well, the third point on our list is, well, Pete, I'll let you take it because I think it's your category. The Shadow of Mordor.
Oh yeah,
Nemesis System.
So now we're going to venture a bit outside of the conventional scope of a video like this.
Yeah.
We're going to be getting into choice in general, whatever way it may manifest itself, in games which aren't focused around choice, games which are, any way which choice can manifest itself. So I think one of the most compelling ways choice can manifest itself in gaming is what was done with the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor and subsequently Shadow of War. The Nemesis system is one of the most compelling and exciting mechanics in gaming, in my opinion. It really feels like you can create your own rivalries and adventures and basically craft your own place in this world based around the conflicts that you find yourself in and the histories in those conflicts. I'm sure you've seen plenty of crazy videos on the Shadow of War games, where you can completely humiliate some orcs and they lose their standing within their own gang, so to speak, and they go insane based on the embarrassment and stuff like that, and they remember it, and eventually they completely start forgetting everything, and you can almost feel bad for them. And that's only one example of the things you can do. The game remembers if you took somebody out by burning them or cutting their face, and when they come back, they'll have a burned face or a cut face. And and not only that, like, you can, if you take out one enforcer, it creates a power struggle, which puts other people in charge or not. You can have like little informers and stuff like that, and it's just such a complex and solid system that never feels fake or artificial. And it's very unfortunate that the reason more people haven't really exploited it is because fucking Warner Bros. Fucking patented it. They patented one of the most exciting mechanics in gaming, despite the fact that they copied they absolutely stole and took inspiration from other games in making their own. But I guess they managed to patent it, and that's why we didn't have people playing with it. But I think that patent recently expired, or will expire soon, and so maybe we'll see more games utilize this, because I think having a dynamic system or several systems which interact with each other in terms of what your opponents are doing and your relationship with them is just really compelling and really makes the world feel alive in a way which other games just don't do. Yeah.
So what I want to ask you is, why did you think this was worth discussing in light of the fact that we just talked about narrative choice? This is gameplay choice, is it not?
Yeah.
And somewhat world-building choice.
Yeah, because at the end of the episode, we kind of want to talk about the future of choice in gaming and kind of what direction games are going in terms of emergence. And it's definitely going to include something like the Nemesis system, because I don't want to spoil the whole conversation now, but we ultimately think that games will ultimately become about crafting your own adventure that truly feels your own and include the player within the creative process in a way. And I think it's important to mention the Nemesis system in that context. So... yeah.
So it's kind of like the foreground, the first almost in terms of the gameplay driven choice to an extent. Perhaps that's fair to say, at least in modern times. One that's done it successfully. And I have to say, I have a limited knowledge on this. I played the game for a little while, but I didn't really understand the Nemesis system in detail. Mm-hmm. Can you perhaps just give us an example of how it works in practice? And use specific examples, just how it would work.
So, so there's different chains of command, right? There's capos, enforcers, whatever. And whoever you take out in that game or brutalize and turn into your informer, that has an impact on everybody else and the whole gang within that. From top to the bottom, from the capo to the grunts. And the characters, the enemies remember these things and know that you did it, unless you took actions to prevent that. And they'll react to that. For example, let's say you make one enforcer lose his power and he becomes shunned, and somebody under him takes control. If you bump into that person, they will know that you were the reason why that happened, and they'll make like a comedic comment on that.
That's really...
It can also create like these cinematic rivalries, where... Like I said, if you don't actually fully take out an orc by accident, let's say they got away, when you see them again, they'll remember the interaction and the fact that you fucked them up. And maybe that'll give them an extra buff or something within
Right.
that specific thing.
Right.
You can, over time, by subjecting orcs to something, you can make them have new debuffs, like a fear of something or something like that. And
Okay.
yeah, a lot of really dynamic elements to it, which make the world feel alive. Yeah, because ultimately, a lot of games, especially open world games, are just purely about conflict and dealing with an enemy. And if you make the enemies dynamic, that does a huge chunk of making the world feel alive. So yeah.
And it makes, like you said, like almost every future encounter more memorable,
Yeah.
and it almost plays into the narrative choice element.
Mm-hmm.
It's a strongly consequential thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not a prior thing. It's not, but it's. I think it's important to discuss, as we kind of you alluded to, is that we want to talk about gameplay choice too, because, well, we'll move on to this shortly, but the future of games in terms of choice may actually not be the conventional form like we've seen with The Walking Dead. I, for one, think that model is gone. I think that
Yeah.
won't come around too much often. I think, unfortunately, and even though they're trying to make The Wolf Among Us 2 right now, I noticed they're taking a long time on it. And now, granted, Telltale had a hell of a lot of problems outside of just development, I imagine, with the whole studio closing, etc. But if The Wolf Among Us 2 isn't wildly successful and revolutionary, I don't know if they're going to keep this. I don't know. I'm not an
Because
expert,
one
I'm
thing
just-
that you need to take into consideration is that there's almost like a balancing scale that you need to constantly think about. Because the more player choice you give in terms of impacting the narrative, the less special the narrative will feel. The more there is, the narrative will suffer in terms of cohesion, in terms of writing.
I would say generally speaking.
Yeah, in terms of logic, in terms of everything about it. If it feels like you can change a whole narrative on a whim, sure, it's fun and dynamic, but you will never achieve these massive cinematic narrative moments that you do with these other games.
Yeah.
Now, there is an argument to be made that I think most gamers don't actually care that much. A lot of them don't care about the narrative very much, and if they have something dynamic that's fun, a lot of people would prefer that. But that's another conversation entirely. Maybe I think one thing that maybe you should go over is that there have been others which have tried to replicate the Nemesis system and failed monstrously, and Watchdog's Legion comes to mind here. So. Yeah.
Oh right, yes. I remember that's a footnote of ours to discuss. Well, I got to say, I didn't play the game. Obviously, I did a lot of work and reading into it. I read into it very much because I was curious about it. They were claiming it to be this new system where you could simply choose whoever you wanted from the world, interact with them, create story based off that character, and it would have consequence, etc. I mean, what do you think What do you have to share about it? Because I'd like to be enlightened about. Why it's.
I think the game was terrible, truly terrible. Because in order to accommodate the system, they completely deconstructed the game and dumbed it down and removed things which are great about Watch Dogs 2, gameplay-wise.
Right.
But that's beside the point.
Right.
But once again, maybe something else to consider. You have to sacrifice a lot of other things in order to streamline the process for a system like this.
Yes,
which is never good. But the issue is that ultimately there was a very shallow and limited pool of character profiles, right? And eventually, very quickly actually, you start seeing the same patterns over and over. And by seeing the same patterns, even though you're technically dynamically impacting everything, it makes the world feel way less alive. It makes it feel arbitrary and very much like a game. And it really negatively impacts your experience of the game. Because you can't even focus on having fun with the gameplay anymore because you have these really not compelling elements where you have, plus it completely randomized characters, so they would be dressed in completely random ways. You would have like some old guy talking like a middle schooler or and stuff like that, and it would follow the same storylines over and over. And I was expecting, like, because one of the mechanics they hyped up was you can help somebody with a problem and then you'll be able to recruit them. But they never comment on you helping them with their problem. You just kind of do the problem, and then they're like, all right, I'll join DeadSec. And it's like, it feels just very simplistic, and it actively harmed the game, in my opinion. So, yeah.
I always felt like whenever randomization, AI, or anything gets involved with it, to try to, create this kind of world, to get that balance, I always get worried whenever they're trying to just automate stuff. You need this element of curatedness.
Yes.
You need to have craftsmanship. That I just think it's a great point, and it's a fair point to say, look, you need to have this balancing, and if it's not present, oftentimes it's going to hint one way or the other, where it goes disaster choice, or Instead, it goes interactive choice, and I think that's a really good point to mention, Pete. To be honest.
Yeah. Because, like I said, technically you have a lot of dynamic elements in this game, but they actively harm the game, which is interesting.
Right.
So I just thought I should mention that. It doesn't always work. But yeah, I think we've talked enough about the Nemesis system.
We have.
We should go into... well, maybe you can go over what we have next. So.
Well, our next point to talk about is, again, in the gameplay category, because we kind of covered really consequential and inconsequential. We don't really feel, at least I don't, that we need to break that down even further for any reason.
No.
So, again, I think where we need to focus now is gameplay, because there is this new trend that games have started to simulate choice through decision making and gameplay. So we've wrote down here the idea of, and we've coined the term emergent immersive simulation choice. So what we're talking about here is mostly Cyberpunk for its recent innovations in choice in gameplay. Pete has noted down Prey, and I've put down just in brief Hitman. What are we trying to show here and why?
So yeah, I mean, Cyberpunk isn't new. I'm talking about like immersive sims where the way you explore the game and the way you deal with the issues within it is very emergent, and there's a lot of choice in the order in which you do things, etc. And there's ultimately a large array of tools that you have, and connecting that with the very good level design of something, there's a lot of ways to tackle a situation, and the way you tackle that situation kind of gives you insight into your own character in a way, and makes you feel more in tune with your own character, and most importantly, makes your character feel like they belong in this world, and that they have a place in it. And the whole immersive sim element is, I mentioned Cyberpunk, because it takes elements from games like Deus Ex, where Deus Ex is like basically what I said, where you have, it's basically a stealth game, but you can tackle things in whichever way you want. And in Cyberpunk, all of the gigs and side jobs kind of had this element where you had like a really well-designed place, a building, a junkyard, whatever, and then using your arsenal, you could manipulate elements of that area to achieve what you want. And I had a blast doing that with my character, because mine was a netrunner, and I could just sit outside, hack through a mainframe, go through the cameras, and then just blow everybody's brains out, and nobody even knows I was there. And that made me feel really good, because there's a moment later in the game where if you do a certain side quest, you can have like this little flavor text where you can talk about you being the best netrunner in Night City. And I really did feel like I was the best netrunner in Night City. And that's like, once again, something where your choice of how to build your character and how to deal with situations places him somewhere within this world. So maybe I'm going like a little bit out there.
Well, no, I have lots to say about this as well, if I may. So I agree with you that there are some elements in Cyberpunk where, for example, you tackle a certain side objective or a certain mission in a certain way, and then the characters in turn relay some dialogue to you to suggest, like, we acknowledge the way you've approached the situation. Yeah. I've had that. What I would say to you then is two points, really. It's just one, is it illusory? As just the obvious rebuttal. Is it illusory? And how could it be improved? Because I hope you agree with me that it's not really in the most complete form.
No, absolutely not. No.
And I also wanted to make a short distinction between this game and something like Breath of the Wild, because we're not talking about where you move to places to get certain changes in the choice-based narrative. It's instead about gameplay choices and almost like strategy choices, ways you approach situations.
Ways you build. So basically, Prey does this very well too, because in Prey, you can build your character to be a hacker, to be like somebody who's a psychic energy, somebody who's a big hulking fucker who can lift shit up, etc. And the level design has a bunch of avenues in which you can use that specific build. And you can even combine builds together, and so you have like almost, okay, I can access A and B now, but if I do it another way, I can access C, D, and E. And so, once again, it helps place your character in the world and make him make sense and characterize him in terms of what his capabilities are. Because it's ultimately actions that define a person, you know, more than anything.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, you're kind of building your own character. And another game now this is kind of a little less so, but Hitman as well. Now, Hitman is not an open world or an RPG or anything like that, so it doesn't really, plus you have a very distinct character who already exists in the world, but once again, you have a bunch of different ways and ultimately choices on how to tackle a situation. So that's basically what I'm talking about here, and that's for me has been one of the most impactful things in terms of how I feel about the character. So once again, the reason I'm talking about it is because this is another puzzle piece into what is necessary to have really good choice-based games in the future. So yeah.
So this is kind of like an extension to what you would consider to be a great game with great choice. This is something that needs to be added on, as well as what hopefully we'll discuss in the future what we want to see. But this is like an extension. It's not really a core element of choice.
No, it's an extension. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And I was thinking that this harkens back almost to Skyrim, where, for example, if you wore a certain set of armor, the guards would interact with you differently, and it would role play. You know, it's like you wear the Daedric armor, and you get the mages going, "Oh Christ, he's wearing Daedric and stuff." It's like that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, but obviously it's expanded since then. In Cyberpunk, I still think Cyberpunk doesn't nail it.
No,
and
I'm
trying to think of an example, that does.
Yeah, because it rarely. It would be nice if in games like this you would get not only what you imagine in your own mind about how the character is, but you can also get an actual response to how you've been playing the game, and this doesn't happen even in Cyberpunk. And it would just be really cool if they could comment more on your emergent gameplay and the choices you made within tackling something. Now, Cyberpunk does try, but it just doesn't do enough, in my opinion. So, yeah. Plus,
so let me ask you one question before we move on, Pete. Sorry, I just have to say this. Maybe it's a good point, maybe it's not, but I feel like the morality system in Red Dead is somewhat similar. But I want to ask you the question of how different is it? Because it plays with the morality system, which is an extension of how you act in the game and what decisions you make, and that affects dialogue, that affects cutscenes, and so is that similar, or is it not
very
similar?
much similar. So, and that's another thing that is a problem with Red Dead. Like, I love Red Dead 2, you know that, my top 3 games of all time, but Red Dead has a bunch of systems which are very tacked on and very shallow. And this is one of them. The morality system, it's not even a thing. Like, it's bullshit in my opinion. It doesn't make any sense at all. But on top of that, my biggest issue with Red Dead is that no matter how good your disguise is, no matter whether you change your clothes or anything, whether you're new to a town, the lawman will always be able to tell that you are Arthur Morgan. And so that kills the whole emergent aspect of the game, because you can plan the perfect heist, thinking about everything, but if the lawmen spot you once, it's done. And there's a lot of stuff like this. Like, there's a place where you can rob a back room, and it's like a casino game, right? I literally played it perfectly, where I used a bow to kill all of them before anybody sounds the alarm. Nobody should know what happened. I even, once again about the morality system, I didn't kill the clerk. I just roped him up so he doesn't go tell anybody about what I'm doing. And it doesn't matter. The moment you get in that room, the police are notified of what you did somehow, as if there's fucking CCTV cameras. And not only that, there's like another door you could go from the back door, a metal one, but you can't blow it up. You literally cannot go from there, despite the game showing you that you technically should. Which means that a game forces you to go back the same way you went, so you can get greeted by the lawman and have a huge shootout. And that's lame, because if a game feels like you have a lot of choice about how you tackle something, but you don't have any because of one fucking stupid reason. So I think that's more of a failure of this type of thing. But yeah.
To conclude, I have to add that I found the emergent choice to be there to some extent, where, for example, on the honor system, how you interacted with certain characters would be distinctly different based on if you were in the black or white category, the good or bad. Yeah. So characters would perceive you and be scared of you, or they would respond differently. Arthur would talk differently. He would say, "Hey there, Mister," if he was on the good side, and he would be like, "Hey there, Mister," if he was on the bad side. And these kinds of things added to that. That's what I liked.
Okay.
As well.
Let me just add, I do think that you had a lot of different scenarios that popped up based on where your honor was. I think the bullshit thing is that the way you change your honor makes absolutely no sense. It was made by somebody
it's completely flawed. I agree.
With the most skewed and moronic moral compass in the world. Like, I can fucking butcher an entire town, but then I can go to another town and say hello to everyone and greet them, and then my honor somehow goes up as if that makes up for it. Yeah. Like, another thing is that if I kill some random person in the middle of nowhere, that drags down my honor. And even if I do it once, I get a cutscene where I think Tilly or somebody talks to Arthur about how he's killing random people and he doesn't even know why, whatever. But compared to the amount of people I fucking kill in missions, it's nothing.
Right.
Like, you mass murder people in missions, and I think that disconnect is just a big problem. But yeah.
Well, I also don't. I mean, we're getting way off tangent here, but nevertheless, I hate the fact that it's just black and white. I hate that it's not nuanced at all, and it doesn't take into fact like just location, for example. Like you mentioned, if you kill someone in the middle of nowhere, is it a subjective honor system? Is it like his moral compass, or is it an objective standard? It's not really. Essentially, to kind of conclude on this point is just I feel like emergent simulation choice is so far from being perfect.
Exactly.
But it needs to be improved upon because that is the future. Because that is what people are expecting nowadays, and that's what we want, to some extent.
Yeah, and ultimately, nobody's even trying to improve it for some reason. That's the biggest thing I dislike.
It must be a logistical issue. It must be so difficult. I mean, I'm not a dev designer. I have no idea, but it must be so hard, and it's a shame because...
But that's the thing. This is one of the things where like people expect a lot of effort put into it, because even the most minor issue or flaw in a dynamic system can really impact your enjoyment of the game. Which is why it's actually dangerous to put things like this in that don't completely deliver on what they promise. Because if you have a game that is based around dynamic systems, and that is the core of it, but those dynamic systems are flawed, the game will suck despite everything else. And that's why, probably one of the reasons why people don't try it. But damn, if like I wish somehow somebody would be able to make like a game-breaking innovation in this field, so we can have a...
Me too.
But, yeah.
Okay, so we probably should move on now for the interest of time. So our next category that we've coined in terms of choice is the idea of time. And again, there is only a limited amount of IPs you and I have discussed at length that kind of fit into this. One that I would bring up straight away is the Outer Wilds.
Yeah.
There are other games like Breath of the Wild, Pathologic 2, which we'll discuss. Can you explain to me what your term is, and then we'll just kind of define it quickly?
Yeah.
So
for me, this is generally about on RPGs. Generally, this is where it pops up, and for me, it's the symbiotic relationship between time and exploration and avenues, pretty much. There's a few games which do it well. I think the game that does it best is probably Pathologic 2, but ultimately, it's that there are certain events, there are many events and many characters that will happen in the story, right? There's events that will happen and characters that will do things that impact other events in the game. It's a dynamic set of events that happens, and you only have so much time in the day to tackle them. So you kind of have to make a choice about where you're going to go and what you want to do and how that will further you to achieve your aim. And sometimes you can make the wrong choice and you lose time. And sometimes you make the right one and it sends you much further on your journey that you want. And I think that's a really compelling thing where, like I said, the world exists with or without you. And it's, and it's your choice where what you're going to interact with. And it matters when and what you choose to do. And it can drastically change the story. And very few games do it, but the games that do are amazing. Pathologic 2, Outer Wilds, and even to a lesser extent, Breath of the Wild did it. Breath of the Wild does it in a much more cutesy fashion.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I was actually going to ask you, because I wasn't sure. I feel like we haven't wrote this down as a category, but I'm just going to say it, and we're going to move straight back to what we're talking about now. But there is also the idea of the explorative decision making, like Elden Ring and like Breath of the Wild. Even though they're not really choices, I would say. But I just wanted to say that. We're not going to talk further, but I wanted to say the Outer Wilds was a fantastic experience, first and foremost. And if anyone hasn't played it, play it. It's really great.
Yeah.
I feel like the idea of time and choices is just so not underutilized. Again, I don't want to harken back to this underutilized theme, but it's not utilized. I don't know what to say about it. It's just I can't think of. I haven't played Pathologic 2, by the way, but I will. But Outer Wilds was just exceptional. It was such a unique take on choice, and I say choice in the sense that you're not really making any choices. Interestingly, you're forced to make concessions almost. That's almost like what you're main. And then there's the replayability factor. So then you can then work out which it's such a it's almost it does harken back to our emergent idea, where it's just like you tailor your own experience to fit your world.
Exactly.
You role play it, and the game adapts almost like a liquid sponge to allow you to do whatever the fuck you want.
Exactly.
And
it's like, I think this is something that has been lost, because I think the reason is because there seems to have been this change in expectations and in demographic with gamers. Maybe it's actually just companies just smoking crack, but I don't know. Old school RPGs like Morrowind were always about this. It was about you crafting your own adventure, and kind of the game was not about you. It was about you making choices and experiencing the world. And it's different now, in that games are almost made based around this utilitarian convenience, where they're like they're there just to be convenient for you, and everything in the world is kind of melded around you and your character. Right. So you have everything constantly at your fingertips. You're constantly moving on, and it's almost like games are now just about making sure that you will keep playing it for as long as you can, and maybe play it so much that eventually you'll want to buy some microtransactions or something. And that's a fundamental shift. But I think that it probably is just like corporations just finding a way to monetize games more. That's what it is. Because I think that
I hate how we always talk about this.
Yeah.
It always comes up, and it's like one episode a month we have to talk about the commercial reality and the bullshit we have to deal with.
But ultimately, I think most gamers nowadays do prefer the old. Elden Ring fucking proved it. Proved that players want old school style RPGs where it feels like you're exploring a new world and it's not made for you. It feels like you're discovering something. Yeah.
Can I just? This might be way crazy, but we'll go for it. I feel like we're at a really difficult time right now in terms of video games, in terms of innovation, in terms of the future, because we're kind of in this point where like every game that comes out is good for a month and it falls flat. There's one that comes out a year that's really good.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the fuck up.
And this is in my view. And instead, we're in this crisis right now where game devs are really sitting down and thinking, what the fuck is the next thing? And I feel like no one's cracked it yet. And I feel like if someone watches this podcast, they might be able to crack it. Like, all you need to do is figure out how to do choices properly. It's just like, have an innovative, completely forward-thinking, future-modern way of doing choices, and you will crack it, and it will be the next big thing.
Emergent gameplay.
That's some
Emergent gameplay is the future. It's just, and it's always been the future in a way. It's one thing that is very difficult to do, and we need some kind of technological innovation which will allow for it to be easier. So basically, developers and writers can focus on making a good game, but there's this system that they can play with, right?
Unfortunately, it's AI, isn't it? AI.
I think. Look. I do think AI will eventually get there, but despite the weed that Elon Musk smokes, we're nowhere near there yet. We're still.
I agree. Yeah.
So. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess we move on to our next category. So, our next category, we have labeled it Chaos Theory, the Human Condition. And we're really just going to harken back to Stanley Parable. Now, I mean, it's interesting because they're re-releasing this game. Have you by any chance seen exactly what that's about?
It's not exactly a re-release. It's pretty much a sequel, almost. Well, it's the same game, but there's so much new content that it might as well be a sequel. So,
ooh,
yeah,
that's fantastic news. So, the Stanley Parable. Where do we start on this one? This feels like an enigma to crack. It's such a big topic.
Well,
and
sorry to interrupt, but it's the only game we have here which has its own genre. We've given it Chaos Theory.
Exactly, it just exists in a bubble.
Yeah.
I just wanted to emphasize that I don't feel like you and I can talk about this in enough detail just within this segment. It's impossible. I do feel like it's one of a kind, and I do feel like specifically under the idea of choice, it is up there on a pedestal. Maybe with two other games, perhaps. You know, it's really in a league of its own. But why is it significant, and why does it fall into our latter part about gameplay choice? Because it, in my view, is a perfect balancing blend of the gameplay choice and narrative choice. In fact, it's almost like one and the other are the same, which is just one of the most bizarre things.
That just makes me smile. Like, narrative and choice being the same. It's just
it's just beautiful.
Yeah.
Again, I feel like it's important to say straight off the back, this probably is what we're talking about in the future for other games, but it's just unfortunately, this is why it was kind of. I said this to you earlier. It's like created in like a Steam. What would you say? Like a Steam engine, almost like the actual Steam Valve guys. It's like they put it into one of their engines, and they've almost like Portal 2 map, and they've designed it in this limited space. It doesn't feel like it could be an expansive game. That's what I'm saying.
The reason for that, I mean, you might know this, but the game started out as a Half-Life 2 mod. Actually, that's what Stanley Parable was, and then they turned it into its own game. But yeah, one of the reasons why it works so well is also once again compromise. It's a very simple game, as you said, that it feels like it was made in a Steam engine, and yeah. But damn, is it good? You made like a really cool point on top of the whole choices narrative about how it almost mirrors like how real life is, and like it's like it kind of reminds me of like Breaking Bad in the sense that it's choices and consequences happening in real time. Like it's all kind of almost like predetermined, and when you make this choice, there's already the consequences happening at the same time, and it's happening in real time. So you can't ever ponder and think about it. You just make choices and things happen. So it has this real life element to it.
Yeah. Now, sadly, it has this comical overtone to it, which I feel like people may not take this segment seriously. Like, are these guys really discussing the Stanley Parable and comparing it to Telltale? Like, what is this? What is this bullshit? But in reality, what I think you and I are trying to share, and at least argue from a point, is just the way that it does produce choice is the way it needs to be done, in my view. Like, it's just perfect. I don't even know where to go from here. It's just like I would love to see this formula used in a game like Elden Ring. As crazy as it sounds, as absolutely crazy as it sounds, it's the idea that you walk this way and everything changes. You walk this way and the narrative changes. Like, you would have to write 50 stories, I feel, maybe more. You know.
And once again, we can combine this with the time constraint thing, where you can walk this way, but you're walking at the wrong time, which means that something happens, or the right time, which leads to something else. You know, like it feels like the way it works in real life, where it's random, which is why we nicknamed it Chaos Theory. But yeah.
And then we put in the idea of emergent sim and the way you walk and the directions you walk, the people around you reflect on you, and they have certain dialogue.
We're like, I mean, I'm sure other people that have like considered this. It's just very hard to do, I imagine, nowadays. I do hope that eventually, like, we will have games like this. But yeah.
So, is there anything else to share about Stanley Parable? Like, why we've brought it up? We've kind of explained it. We've kind of explained why it's so unique. Or have we? Maybe we could share more. It's just like I said, it's just a blending of where you go in the game, reflects exactly the choices you make, reflects exactly the story you hear, the places you see. I mean, everything is like a ball, and it's just where the ball goes. Everything, it's like real life almost.
Yeah, the game is also like kind of jokey and really satirical about it, because it's like, well, you have a narrator telling you which way to go, but you kind of break the rules and do the opposite of what he says as often as you can, which is kind of like in its own like a perfect description about the way the gamers like react to choice in games, which is like you don't only want to follow the choices that the writers gave you. You want to feel like you're kind of breaking the game in a way. Like, you want to feel like you actually made something unique, which is interesting. But yeah.
So your point is like, it's cool when the developers guys, they actually introduce a story for if you break the game. It's kind of like if you depart from the path that they are imagining. It's like, look, we've actually created this path as well. We thought of that.
Once again, you want everything to feel like it is real and dynamic, not that you're basically just going for different static slideshows, pretty much. This applies to other things as well. Like even works with traversal. Like, you know, in some games, you technically have a lot of verticality in ways you can traverse everything, but it's actually very linear. Like in the Horizon games, there's only a very few specific areas where you can actually parkour or whatever. Whilst in like something like Death Stranding or Assassin's Creed, it's dynamic in that there's an actual physics system which allows you to explore everything in the way you want, and that feeling is very important. It makes a big difference. It makes a difference that in Death Stranding you can place grappling hook, or not a grapple, but like a grappling thing or a ladder wherever you want, and
Right.
or have like situations like where you put a ladder between two ridges and then you ride your motorcycle on it, stuff like that. So
I just wanted to share with you, like, if you combine all of these ideas and put them into the next Rockstar game, I feel like that's just the game I dreamed about as I was a kid. Like, that's what I always wanted to play. Still haven't really played it, but that's always what I wanted to do, is play a game which had all these choice options and time constraints and immersive simulation and all these things. And almost had the Stanley Parable thing, especially. And it's kind of like simulating life to an extent. And that's what we're never going to... It's like... It's more of a philosophical question. Do you think we'll ever play a game like that? I'm just asking you that. Like, generally, no logical basis.
I think so, just not anytime soon. And that's what I think. Also, I don't think that we want it necessarily to simulate life exactly. To have systems that work in a lifelike fashion. I still think that ultimately people want video games, not a life simulator.
Yeah.
But I mean, to have systems which function similar to real life. That's what I mean. So, yeah.
Okay, so the last category that we're going to discuss is, we've called it CRPG.
Yeah.
And we're going to focus on Disco Elysium, Pillars of Eternity, and maybe Divinity.
Yeah.
Now, why is this the last category? No, why is this a category altogether, actually? What is unique about, for example, Disco Elysium that makes the choices so unique?
Well, yeah, because CRPGs were supposed to, when they came out, they were supposed to kind of mimic the tabletop setting, where the actual board game, the D&D or whatever. And then those games are the purest form of complete emergence, and where choice is everything. Because you're working with an actual human being, right? You have a dungeon master, and the dungeon master can do whatever the fuck he wants. Well, he has some restrictions, but he that's a human brain capable of creativity and problem solving and storytelling, right? That's the big difference there. And these games kind of try to emulate that, and that's why they're kind of in their different.
Right.
In the different category. And yeah, Disco Elysium is a classic one. Pillars of Eternity and Divinity are classic. I think Disco Elysium in particular does it really well because it combines a few elements where you are capable of doing certain things based on how you build your character or how you dress your character. And there's even an element of luck, of course, to it with RNG. There's an element in the game where there's this neo-Nazi or something like that, Bezier, this big hulking idiot. And my character was not physical, he was sensitive, if I remember correctly. So there was a pretty low chance of me actually knocking him out. But I rolled it, and I was lucky, and I managed to knock the shit out of him. And that was really enjoyable. But and there's like so many different things you can do in the game, and I think the most compelling part of Disco Elysium is that you actually also shouldn't completely exhaust all your dialogue options because what you choose to say colors your character and also colors the other character's opinion of your protagonist. And that's something that I don't see very often because in games normally you want to use all of the dialogue options, but here you really have to be careful, which I thought was interesting. So
the choice-based system in this is just so much more in depth than anything we see commercially or mainstream.
Yeah.
I mean, Disco, at least from playing that just at least multiple times, you can see that you can have a completely different playthrough, have completely different interactions, and your character as well. I think this is the most, principally the best point, is your character is so curated and individualized based on the choices you choose.
That's the thing.
So
he's a character that is so lifelike and so three-dimensional that basically whichever choice you make, there can be something which can explain why he is like that, regardless of whatever political beliefs he has about his history. Like, you can choose throughout the whole game to use your fake alias, Raphael Ambrosius Cousteau, to never find out your real name and just become somebody else, right? To become a new character, to have complete rebirth. Or you can choose to find your face in the mirror and find out your real name and dig into your past. Or not do either of those things, and I think.
Can I add? You can be a hobo cop. You can be a communist. You can be obsessed with disco and just be dancing all the time. You can talk to your own tie and listen to its thoughts. It's
Yeah.
just insanely detailed.
Also,
And-
this is genius, but you have your organs. Your organs represent your special abilities and your, just, yeah.
I actually think you and I should do a whole episode on this game
Yeah,
and really
sure.
dissect it and talk about it. But the one thing I think that we could really discuss here is just could disco choices, for example, just take disco, even though we haven't talked about the other games, but CRPG choices, could they work in something like a Telltale game? Or could they work in something like a AAA narrative game? Like where you have a huge list of choices, basically. And giving the player more to read. Is that something that would it be so conflicting to take away from the immersion, or would it actually allow you to have that choice factor? Or is that an
I'm
option?
gonna give a pretentious answer, but maybe the expectations of what a AAA game should change. Maybe they should just change. Maybe AAA games shouldn't be so focused on having raw graphical fidelity and all of that. And maybe they should be focused more on choice, where the graphics are perhaps a bit more, not as impressive as before, a bit more simple.
Sure.
And so we're technically having an upgrade path which is not conventional, but it focuses more on depth than breadth of fidelity.
I agree.
So maybe that's.
I think
the way
I
we should
agree.
go. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, another thing I think they should get rid of combat, get rid of the stupid QT events, get rid of any form of button mashing, just get rid of it and just have it through some sort of cinematic cutscene. Just have it all. I'd rather it just be full on choices and then
Not all games. Like there could be like Sifu's.
I'm thinking of
and that has based on combat. But I think there should be more AAA games.
I was just thinking of like Detroit,
Yeah.
for example. Taking Detroit as an example, it fails in every other department except choice, really, and the cinematicness of the game. So it's like get rid of the stuff you don't really need and you're putting in there for no reason.
Or
not
maybe,
in the cases.
maybe we shouldn't change like the entirety of AAA gaming, but maybe one AAA studio could try something different. Put their massive money and their massive talent, their bottomless budget to do something different like this. So
all comes down to money, doesn't it?
Yeah.
At the end of the day. And I feel like Telltale tried and tested this formula for everyone, took the risk, paid for it when it didn't work out. And then the other companies were like, okay, well, let's just make it a bit more about choice and we can make it gorgeous in a AAA game and we'll make a success of it. And then you get games who are like, listen, we're going to focus on the gameplay. We'll try to put some in, like say, for example, Elden Ring or Breath of the Wild. And they do their own particular unique thing and it works fantastically. It's like Telltale took all the risk almost for me.
Well, granted, I think Telltale made some really boneheaded management decisions. I think it's funny, Telltale kind of did what Netflix has been doing as well, where instead of focusing on your big money makers and improving your formula, like you have let's say free games which are big money makers and they all kind of tap into different demographics and you improve your actual formula, right? They didn't do that.
Yep.
They decided to invest in a bunch of random fucking crap and expand their kind of puddle to be like very wide but completely shallow. They never upgraded their formula. They just kind of applied their basic formula to a bunch of different IPs, and a lot of them people didn't care about, and it's just a weird choice. I think that's.
I really hope.
Yeah.
I hope they redeem themselves with the next few games they're making.
Yeah.
They're releasing the sci-fi game. I forgot the name of it. Maybe you remember, man.
Expanse.
That game.
I'm excited
Expanse.
for that. The Expanse can be very good. So.
It seems like to me they've got their focus back.
Also,
So
you know what they're doing? They're doing season 2 of Tales from the Borderlands.
right. I've seen this rumored. Yeah. Okay. That's cool too. That's good.
So it seems
So they're basically honing in on what people loved.
Exactly. So maybe they'll be good. They'll redeem themselves. Yeah.
But in terms of Don't Nod and Square Enix with Life is Strange, I'm a little bit concerned because Life is Strange 3 I thought was pretty good. Again, it lacked real depth and choice to it. I felt it was just about a simple interactive story, and they're trying to have that classic feeling that Life is Strange 1 had when we were all slightly younger, where we felt almost like nostalgic and it had this hippiness that we loved about it. It's not the same feeling now. I'm a little older.
Yeah. However,
for me, it does.
Don't not have done some impressive stuff in the realm of choice. They made the game Vampire, however the fuck you pronounce it.
Oh yeah,
and I think that game dealt with choice very well. Actually, that's actually a completely different genre that we forgot to mention. But Vampire was really good in that you were a character who was very powerful and who could impact the lives of the people around him. You could choose to be a monster, or you could choose to help people, and you could be selective about the way you did it. And you ultimately, the way the choice manifested itself is in the impact on people's lives. It was kind of very unique to be this person who was powerful and who could impact the world around him, and it was in a completely apocalyptic world. And I think that was kind of really cool. It was a
you
very...
could be more powerful. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you could be more powerful if you made the world worse around you.
If you drank as much blood as possible, and you kind of had to be selective about who you're going to kill, who you're not going to help, and it was kind of cool what they did, in my opinion. And they actually succeeded. They didn't really fail, so yeah.
It just wasn't really. It didn't hit mainstream success, right? That's unfortunate. Yeah.
I think the reason why is probably because of the combat. I think.
Yeah. There was unfortunately a few issues with it, from what I've heard and stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I really enjoyed this conversation, Pete, and I feel like I have got a lot to look forward to in the future, and I have more anxiety about what games are coming out next with choices involved. Mm-hmm. At least I hope that we've got across our mission statement, which is to try to define choice, clarify that it's different in many ways, and we looked at, let's say, the mainstream genres, and we said, look, some of these aren't exactly choice, it's illusory, etc., it's non-consequential. And instead, you've got these other games which really do have serious choice involved. And they deserve more notoriety.
I think the ultimate conclusion is that what we did is we tackled choice in whichever way it manifests itself in games. Not only narratively, but in terms of the choice of the player, how he wants to explore the world.
Yes.
And that kind of ties into what Peter Molyneux was talking about. Sorry, I always laugh when I say Peter Molyneux. He's the guy who made Fable, but he made a good point, though. He thinks that the future of gaming is very focused, as we said, around choice, and very focused around games which, as I said, involve the players in the creative process, where it feels like you're crafting your own adventure, and it is uniquely yours. And that is definitely the future of gaming. Of course, being himself, he hasn't made anything yet. But yeah. However,
is there a new Fable game in the works?
There is one game called Wildermyth, which has tried this. And Wildermyth is based completely around. It feels like a D&D game where choice is everything about the game and the narrative. And there's a lot of random events that could happen which can change the choice, and your characters can get old, and then you recruit new ones, and these characters are now legends that people talk about later on. And I think Wildermyth did a good job, but once again, the failure is with AI. The AI doesn't always do a good job of making the dynamic thing feel real. So I think that's that's our conclusion, pretty much. Proper choice and emergent gameplay is the future. The thing which will hold it back and make it or break it is the AI, ultimately. So, that's...
Yeah. I think we're done, so Red Pony out. Have a good day. Please subscribe for more videos.
I was with Chloe, and she was having a serious problem too. I'm sorry.
Apparently her problem is worse than mine. So why even bother with me? I'm done anyway.